Oh man, I say all of this out of love, by the way. I love Kyle, man. He's great. He helped me make connections between problems I had in my life with like the drugs that my family were dealing with, and in the political world when I was a lot younger. And so man, these are not like things I'm saying with joy here. These are not things I'm saying with joy. Let's watch. So apparently these two, Kyle and Crystal, have revealed Kyle Kulinski's plan to end the war in Ukraine, his peace plan, his plan that he would propose to try to get Ukraine, the international community, and Russia to agree to in order to end the war. I'm very curious, and I have very low expectations. Let's listen.
So Kyle and friends, today we're going to be talking to Luke Savage, who wrote a phenomenal book on centrism. He's a Jacobin writer, very thoughtful guy, so really looking forward to that. That should be fun. But before we get to that, Crystal, I have some very, very big news.
What's that?
I've done it. I've brought peace to Russia and Ukraine.
Way to go, baby. I'm so proud of you.
So I drafted a plan, and Vlad, it's over, man. Relax, sit back. Zelensky, it's all good. I figured it out. I figured it out. See, so, okay, in all seriousness, though, yeah, I did. You sent me an article the other day, and it was a terrifying article. It was like, this is the trajectory that we're on in Russia and Ukraine. And they walk through it. It's very calm. It's a very sober analysis.
War on the Rocks by Jeremy Shapiro. And the headline is quite provocative. It's We're on the Path to Nuclear War.
Correct. And so I read the article, and by the end of it, I was like, that seems plausible. Like the way he laid it all out, this will happen, this happens, this happens, this happens, and next thing you know, boom, there we are.
So I've read a lot of articles, I've listened to a lot of analysts, and I have my own opinion, even though it's mostly uninformed, but the odds of nuclear war are already tremendously low. And the type of scenario it would look like if it was to happen is not the type of stuff you see in Cold War movies. It would most likely be an artillery delivered device or some truck launched rocket device towards Ukrainian frontline positions that would probably have a very little impact militarily, but quite a horrific impact when it comes to the civilian population. And so the disincentives for Putin not to use a nuke when it comes to the economic isolation that would come with it, since India and China don't want him to use a nuke, the fact that the radiation could end up slapping him in the face if the weather changes and they blow wind towards Moscow, and then they could have a radiated material going towards Russia depending on the weather. If one single person along the chain of command denies Vladimir Putin's orders, then that stops it. One of the key rules of leadership is not to give an order that is likely to be disobeyed. This is an order that has a decent chance it could be disobeyed depending upon what the troops on the ground say or what other generals would do when put in this position by Vladimir Putin. There is a decent chance that there is a massive disincentive from private conversation that Lloyd Austin has had with the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, when it comes to what America would do in a scenario like this, which wouldn't just be seen only with sanctions or with more military aid to Ukraine. That's another downside of this, is the fact that most likely in a scenario where a nuclear weapon is used by the Russians, this would only probably harden the Ukrainian position, because Ukrainians would say, look at this, they're willing to curse us with a second Chernobyl. This shows that Russia doesn't care about us. We must liberate our lands. This would probably mean more aid from the West when it comes to, the UK, when it comes to France, Germany, of course, the United States. This might be something that puts Israel on the path towards supporting more aid to Ukraine, since Israel has not really been in favor of sending any weapons to Ukraine for strategic reasons, geopolitical reasons. There's also a decent chance that there would be a traditional American military response, and the idea of we are using our jets to strike Russian positions that fired these nuclear devices. And so there is a chance, a realistic chance, if this was to occur, which is already an unrealistic scenario, that we would do a strike on Russian soldiers in Ukraine, or do multiple strikes depending on exactly how the strikes went down, the nuclear strikes that is, on Russian positions. This would do nothing but most likely intensify Western support to Ukraine. There's a decent chance it could backfire, decent chance the order would not be obeyed, and it could make Russia an international pariah on the international stage, somewhat, comparable to North Korea. So the odds of this happening, in my perspective, is I don't think it's plausible. Is it possible? Yeah, but I don't think it's very likely whatsoever. And I don't think that we will be helping the state of the world when it comes to arms control, nuclear arms control, if we send the message to the international community, if you invade a country and you destroy your invasion, you're like an incompetent invader, all you have to do is threaten to use nuclear weapons, and then the whole world will come to the negotiating table, give you everything you want because you acted like basically a nuclear terrorist on the world stage. What type of message will that send to Sudan, to Eritrea, to Ethiopia, to North Korea, to Iran, to Israel, to any of these nations in the world that we might not be so happy about if there was to be a nuclear scuffle? What kind of message does it send to Pakistan? There's a reason why India, Pakistan, China, and many of the nations already with nukes would be very against this scenario. Is because they don't want to break the nuclear taboo that has been set since the use of Little Boy and the 2 nuclear bombs that we dropped on Japan at the end of the Second World War. Nobody wants this taboo to be eliminated, so if there's any way to get the Chinese and the Indians to agree to a price cap on Russian oil or to stop taking in Russian oil and natural gas, it would be something like this. This would be one of those scenarios. You want to get the Saudis to cut oil production. This might be the one scenario, to not cut oil production. This might be the one scenario that makes them reverse their OPEC Plus decision. So I think there's so many motivating factors stopping the Russians from using a nuclear device in Ukraine. And even if they do, it probably would not go well for them. Or anyone, but particularly not the Russians.
Right?
Yep.
And so that shook me. I already knew subconsciously and instinctually, like, yeah, that's kind of where we're heading. But to have it laid out in a logical sense,
yes,
whole new ballgame.
Yeah.
So after I read that, I sat there and I'm like, what the fuck can be done? Like, what can be done? And I thought about it long and hard, went through a whole bunch of different, what if we did this, and I settled on what I think is, the least bad of all bad options to get peace in Russia and Ukraine. So the reason I want to do this with you here is because you can poke holes in what I'm saying, say, hey, I don't think that makes sense, or that does make sense, or whatever, and I can get a sense of where I'm at. But I am a massive masochist because everybody's going to fucking hate me for this, right? Like, the people who say, poor Vladimir Putin is just being defensive, they're of course going to fucking hate this, right?
Right.
And then the people who say, literally any sort of peace deal is by definition appeasement and you're Neville Chamberlain.
Right.
They're going to fucking hate me too.
Really hate you.
So it's like,
nobody is against any sort of peace deal. But if there's a peace deal that signs away large swaths of Ukrainian territory or doesn't guarantee Ukrainian security in the future, then all you've done is A, kick the can down the road for a war in the future, and B, basically sign away the lives of thousands of Ukrainians who will end up in mass graves like in Izium, Bucha, and Lyman. So there's a reason why just ending the war doesn't even necessarily mean you're ending the violence. You're just ending the fighting between soldiers, not necessarily the brutalization of civilians.
I'm really shoving my dick in a waffle iron for the sake of intellectual honesty here, even though I know I'm stepping into.
Sometimes that's just what you got to do.
I'm literally tap dancing on I'm break dancing on a minefield right now, but whatever, it is what it is.
Better than nuclear war, though.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. So anyway, first thing is this. Russia, withdraw. Okay, that's my peace deal. Okay, I'm joking, but not really.
Based, end of the video. Can we go to the next video? What do we got next? I think next I wanted to cover this video that was posted, getting a lot of traction on social. Okay, I wish that was the end. That would have been the based video. Okay, 2-minute, 30-second video, done. Would have been perfect. But okay, let's keep going.
Because ideally that is what fucking happens, because when the U.S. invaded Iraq, if I was protesting the Iraq war, you want a proposal? Here's my proposal. Suck my nuts. Withdraw withdraw from Iraq, America, because we were the aggressor. Like, get the fuck out. Okay.
So when you say that, though, do you mean out of Crimea too? Do you mean out of the eastern region, even the part that they had basically, de facto had independence before Russia's most recent invasion?
Yes. My answer to that question would be yes.
I'm largely being facetious. So I'm going to get to my real proposal in a second. That wasn't the serious part, of course.
Okay.
But I just wanted to say that up front because I just want to be clear. They are the aggressor. They launched an
But the problem is if Kyle, his position moves from, well, they should keep this territory, then you're not saying you want Russian soldiers out of Ukraine. You're saying you want Russian soldiers out of the areas of Ukraine that you're not willing to negotiate away in the country you've never been to. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, I'm just, like, it depends on where he goes from here.
Illegal invasion against a country that didn't attack them, you know?
Yeah.
So they're to blame. That's the first point I wanted to make. And I think that's obvious, but plenty of people have brainworms. They won't even agree with that part, right? So anyway, that's the semi-facetious answer. It'd be great if they did it, but they're not going to do it. So now to the real argument.
Okay.
So the first thing, the 4 regions in eastern Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It's Luhansk. I'm going to butcher these names. Luhansk, Donetsk,
Zaporizhia or Zaporozhia.
However you say it, and Kherson.
Taught me how to say it.
Kherson?
Something like that.
Kherson. Okay, those are the 4 regions.
Okay.
Now,
off to a swimming start.
I'm not gonna do a deal where Russia just gets those, because then what you're doing is you're laying the precedent of a bigger country can invade a smaller country and then just demand shit and then get it. And so that lays a precedent where any bigger country can invade any smaller country and say, this is mine now. And then, oh, you don't like that? We'll make a deal.
By the way, this would be still true for Crimea as well. He didn't include Crimea in this, but the same analysis would equally apply to Crimea.
Only give me maybe 20% of what I want, right? I don't like that precedent. That's a bad precedent.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a fucking dispute, and that's a fact. So we have to acknowledge that reality and react accordingly. So what I would say is take those 4 regions and they become either independent countries or it becomes one independent country.
That is... No, nobody's gonna accept this. This is not a realistic peace deal. This is Hoi 4. This is Paradox Gamerland. This is like, well, okay, so you all disagree about Kashmir, or you all disagree about this area. You know what? How about we don't make Israel or Palestine? How about we just give it all to Albania? So therefore, the Israelis can't be mad that the Palestinians have it. The Palestinians can't be mad that the Israelis have it. Like, what do you mean? Nobody in Kherson wants that. Nobody in Zaporozhia wants that. Nobody in Donetsk wants that. Nobody in Luhansk wants that. Or the people who would want that are an unbelievably small minority. The wants of the locals should be taken into consideration here. Not to mention, what would be the defense agreements that this new independent state would be part of? Would they be part of NATO? Would they be part of Russia's security alliances? Would we guarantee them as some weird neutral third country? What would stop the Russians from invading this territory again in the future if they're put in if they're like this weird third path? Who's going to administrate it? Are there going to be free and fair elections? What's going to happen to all the displaced people? Do the displaced people get to come back to this land? Do they get to vote in these elections, unlike have happened with the recent sham referendum? Nobody wants this. Nobody wants this. Just nobody wants this. So it's just, this isn't going to happen. I mean, maybe he can sell me on it, but like, nobody wants this. Nobody wants this. So when he said he would piss everybody off, I mean, like, yeah, but it's also because nobody wants this. Nobody, literally nobody. And it doesn't solve the issue, but whatever.
And you have UN peacekeepers in there to try to keep the peace. And so this way, what you're doing is...
Okay, so the UN peacekeepers, I assume, would be there in perpetuity to stop another Russian invasion. What kind of authority would we give the UN peacekeepers? Would they be given, like, Yugoslavia authority, so, like, nothing really? Or would they be given, like, authority, like, they can shoot back at Russian soldiers? Or possibly Ukrainian soldiers, I guess, in this third option.
Not rewarding Russia for illegally invading, right? But you're also acknowledging the messy reality on the ground. And by the way, everybody hang in there, because at the end of it, there's a big curveball, which I think is an important part of the peace deal. Okay, so that's the first thing.
Okay, so this is a terrible idea. I don't think anybody I know in Ukraine would accept this under any circumstances. I don't think anybody I've talked to has ever seriously proposed something like this or considered something like this. So we're now in like a non-serious kind of like Hoi 4 map drawing kind of like fantasy land with it. And I don't mean to be mean about it, but like this isn't realistic. I don't know what to say about this. And not to mention, you're not rewarding Russia, I guess, quote unquote, directly, but you are punishing Ukraine by taking away large swaths of territory. And one of the things that Russia has pushed for is the federalization of Ukraine to weaken it from a central structure, so it would be easier for Russia to chip away at its sovereignty and authority later and slowly split up the country into itty-bitty pieces. So actually, in a way, this would be rewarding Russia, because they would see this as kind of like a few steps away from a federalized Ukraine. They can then make it very much easier for them to assassinate people and influence local elections and try to make sure that whatever government is made up, since it was being made with the cooperation of the Ukrainian and Russian government, they would make sure they try to get their cronies, their occupational authorities who've made kill lists and executed locals. Gosh, man, no, this is just, I don't think anybody in this territory wants this. And so I guess the bullet that would need to be bitten by Kyle is that you are giving Russia semi what it wants, since it wanted to, this kind of federalization of Ukraine was one of its earlier demands. And you're also signing up a bunch of people to a country they never wanted. You're making a fake, quite literally artificial state based on keeping Russia not too angry, even though the locals don't want to be this semi whatever independent new state. God, I just, it's no, when he said that this was going to piss everybody off, he was right. I mean,
okay,
so it's not Russia's, but they're going to become independent countries with UN peacekeepers. Okay. The second thing is,
this is a terrible idea, just terrible.
Crimea, it's gone. I hate to say it, but it's been gone for 8 years. It's not, and that's the reason why on this particular thing.
Okay, so to be clear, Kyle used the logic on the last one that we cannot incentivize people, we cannot incentivize countries to just invade other countries, take territory, annex it unilaterally, because then you'll encourage this behavior. And he acknowledges that thinking when it comes to Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. He acknowledges that thinking when it comes to those territories, but he won't really bring that thinking in when it comes to Crimea, because it's been 8 years since it was annexed, as if that matters. I mean, like, so what do you mean it's been 8 years, so it's gone? If the Ukrainian military can strike the bridges into Crimea, and they can carry out strikes on Sevastopol, then it doesn't seem like it's completely gone, is it? Not to mention the fact that the Ukrainians have had a string of military successes recently. To say that it's completely off the table, it feels like we're talking about the Ukraine of 2018, not the Ukraine of 2022, of late 2022, that is. So it feels like he acknowledges this logic for one set of territories, but then he just discards it for this one. So far, Ukraine loses 5 oblasts under this peace plan. Russia gets to permanently get Crimea, and I guess Ukraine has to recognize it. Then Ukraine also loses Zaporozhye. They lose Kherson. They lose Donetsk, and they lose Luhansk. I guess that means that the Ukrainians have to stop this counteroffensive that's liberating territory and uncovering mass graves, and they have to actually give up territory to make this work for this new semi-independent state that's being created in this kind of not really federalized version of Ukraine, but this balkanization of Ukraine that's being done.
You know, I would be willing to say, let's just face reality. It's been gone for 8 years, and there's no getting it back. Like, that's not a thing. They're not going to give that up.
Yeah.
I mean, it really depends. I didn't think it was possible before, but if the Russians really keep performing militarily as they do now, then I think the question really is how much are the Russians really willing to fight for it? And if the Russian military can really, like, stand up in Ukraine long term. I mean, like, you could say this about, like, South Vietnam in the 1960s. Like, Vietnam's like a tiny, tiny country. How the hell is it going to get South Vietnam back? Like, they should just accept that South Vietnam, North Vietnam are not going to be reunited. It happened. Like, I know people have said this type of stuff about Ukraine before. Like, how is Ukraine going to stand up against the most powerful military on the planet? They outperformed expectations. They didn't fall in 3 days. They didn't fall in 5 days. They didn't fall in 7 days. It's about to be 250 days they haven't fell. right? They not only have stopped the advance of the Russian army, they have conducted multiple successful counteroffensives around Kiev, around Kharkiv, and it looks like they're about to successfully carry out another one around Kherson. If they carry one out around Zaporozhye, that could be a real death blow possibly to the Russian military. Again, this is all speculation, but I would want to hear from Kulinski why there's no scenario possible where the Ukrainians could get Crimea back. Why is it militarily impossible? Why is it diplomatically impossible, considering recent Russian failures and the fact that the Russian military has had a very hard time going about it recently? I'm not saying that it's guaranteed that Ukraine's going to retake Crimea. All I'm saying is I would want to hear a good reason to give to Ukrainians that, hey, I know you've had all these recent victories, but stop. You must give up all this land. You must give up these 4 oblasts, not to Russia as this weird independent country, and you need to give up Crimea despite recent successes. I just need to, why particularly do we say Crimea off the table? Why is it impossible?
And the other thing, I'll let you finish, but just to make one comment on that also is that, before the war, people were willing to acknowledge that basically most people in Crimea are, Russian ethnic and would prefer to be part of Russia. So I think that's an important reality to acknowledge as well as long.
Well, the problem is, in the last 8 years, a lot of people have been displaced, not able to go back to their homes. The Russians have killed the activists that spoke up against it. But the Russians even have a free and fair election in Crimea to determine if it wanted to be part of Russia. They rigged it. They did it at gunpoint with legislators after they abolished the government. And so I don't really think we could really acknowledge that if there was an election in 2014 when they invaded, that it would have been like, oh yes, we want to be part of the Russian Federation. I don't think we can take that for granted at all. And even if they would have, that would have been the result of basically the Soviet Union's ethnic cleansing policies of the native population, which, doesn't necessarily determine where the Crimean Peninsula should go in the future, but at least gives us a historical background as to why the current demographic position Crimea is in. It's in that position. It's because of a policy purposely instituted by the Soviet Union on this militarily important peninsula. Whether or not we just acknowledge that the people living there now overall want to be part of Russia does not acknowledge the people who have left in the last 8 years or the people who have been killed in the last 8 years. It might be possible. It might be possible that in 2014, if you had a straight up vote, they would have voted to be part of Russia. But we don't know that for sure. We really don't know that for sure.
As well as the fact that you acknowledge, in the eastern part of Ukraine, there was an ongoing dispute about what would happen there. So,
there's an ongoing dispute in a lot of places. There was an ongoing dispute between the Algerians and the French on whether Algeria should be part of France. There was an ongoing dispute between the South Africans and the apartheid regime. There was an ongoing dispute in many locations around the world. There's an ongoing dispute between the Israelis and the settlements in the West Bank. Just because it's an ongoing dispute does not mean that both sides have a legitimate argument.
If you have those regions split off in some fashion from Ukraine, you actually have a more cohesive Ukrainian national project that is more cohesively ethnically Ukrainian.
Yeah.
No, who cares? What do you mean? Wait, so we're basically saying we're going to throw these people to the Russian wood chipper because they speak Russian. Look, I've met people in Kharkiv, I've met people in Zaporozhye, I've met people all across Ukraine who speak Russian due to colonialism. That doesn't mean they need to be part of Russia. I speak English. That doesn't mean I should be part of England. I meet Irish people who speak English. That is not a justification for Ireland being under the crown. There's borders in Ukraine, and we can't just say because this person speaks Russia, they want to be Russian, they want to be part of Russia. That's extremely reductive, and I don't think by purging all of the Russian speakers, either through just carving out the territory with Russian speakers saying, get out of my Ukraine, or anything like that, that's going to make a more cohesive and strong and united Ukraine. God, this peace plan would probably lead to a complete resurgence of the Ukrainian far right. Svoboda would probably be getting like 50 to 100 seats. We'd actually see the right sector and the political wing of Azov unironically take off. And I don't mean that to like even be a bully or be mean here, but they would basically say Zelensky sold out this country. They sold out 5 Ukrainian oblasts, which are no longer part of Ukraine, because of some podcaster. And then there would be anti-Kulinski riots in the streets of Kiev. They would be burning effigies of Kyle Kulinski. It would not be fun. It would be funny, but it wouldn't be fun.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if those arguments convince me that much as it's been gone for 8 fucking years. Like, that's the part that I can't get over. It's like, there's going to be a hard no
Well, I
in
think
any
it
sort of
matters
an
what the
agreement
people on
from
the ground
Russia
think.
if that's gone.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I do think it matters what the people who actually live in that region, or at least lived in the region before this current war, what their wishes and aspirations are. I think
But why do we hold that for Crimea, but not for Kherson, Zaporozhye, Luhansk, and Donetsk, which is very clear from how the war is going, from how the Russian occupation has treated locals, for the amount of direct action and you know, revolting actions that have been taken when it comes to car bombings and stuff like that, when all the polling indicates that they don't want to be part of the Russian Federation. There's no evidence for that. And don't bring up, hey, they voted for Yanukovych in 2012. You know, when Yanukovych tried to outlaw protesting, brutalized protesters, and pulled out of popular economic agreements that can turn people away from Yanukovych. And Yanukovych was never, we're going to become the party of Russia. We are the Russian government now. Candidate. He never ran on that. So voting for Yanukovych and voting to be part of Russia are two very different things. So why is it that we take the local wishes of the people in Crimea into consideration when it comes to giving it to Russia, but we don't take that into consideration when it comes to Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk? And we also, when it comes to Crimea, it just has to do with the people who are there now, not with the people who have been displaced over the last 8 years. It feels like we've completely just accepted like a pro-Russian framing, like right off the bat in this agreement.
I think it's something that should be taken
but
into
a lot of idiots say that about the new regions they just invaded, and I think that's total bullshit.
Yeah, and the other thing, I mean, obviously, like the fake elections they just had.
And they are fake. They're fucking fake. They're fucking fake.
Should not be considered determinative of current public sentiment in any way. I mean, this is part of why, like, the legitimate aspirations of these areas have sort of been fucked over by Putin, because how can you possibly determine what their actual will is now that you've had war and you've had battles and you've had people fleeing and all of that? But anyway, those are my preliminary thoughts.
Okay, so Crimea is gone. Officially recognize it as part of Russia, which again, they invaded.
So by the way, so far, Kyle Kulinski has given Russia most of what they wanted. Even if they don't get to annex Kherson, this third country proposal is something that Russia would 100% probably settle for, because they would see it as a new nation state they could manipulate and drag into their defensive alliance structure. Or they could just view it as something that they would invade in 5 years that would be much weaker than the alliance behind it now. So they would just kick the can down the road. So far, you're not giving Ukraine a really good shake here.
2014, they've been there since.
Yeah.
I don't like it. And honestly, I think the reason why Putin did that is because in 2012, they found natural gas in the waters off Crimea. And so I think he did it because he wanted that natural gas. So it's imperialist, fucked up, but it's gone, right? So, but then we get to Ukraine agrees, no joining NATO, okay?
Wow, we're just giving... Okay, is there anything Ukraine's getting? So Ukraine loses Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. They have to recognize the annexation of Crimea. They lose all of this territory, right? And they don't get a defensive alliance structure to stop Russia from invading in the future. Fantastic. And of course, this new country that's being created that nobody locally wants, that I spoke to, that gets imposed upon them. They don't get to join any alliance structure, I assume, as well. I mean, he didn't say that they would be blocked from joining the Russian alliance structure, so I guess this new alliance can join the Russian alliance structure, but Ukraine still can't join NATO. Okay, fantastic.
So no,
well, he didn't say that explicitly, but he didn't... I think that would be an important part to include with this new country. Like, what alliance structure would they be allowed to be in? What would be their uniting factors? What would this even country be called?
No NATO in Ukraine, Crimea officially Russian. The eastern portions of the country are not going to be Russian. They're going to be independent countries with UN peacekeepers.
Okay, so far every single thing he has said is stuff that Ukraine would say fuck no, fuck no, fuck no. Like every single thing he's just said is just like a no, 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 no. It's just been nothing but fucking Ukraine left, fucking Ukraine on the right, fucking Ukraine sideways. There's not a single part of this deal that make Ukrainians happy. It would already be rejected. Zelensky would have walked out of the room at the first proposal about creating this new country. So, I mean, Putin would probably be, I would say, generally excited with this plan, but I think outside of him, no. And I think for Putin, it would basically be the UN gets to take all this territory from Ukraine that I wasn't even able to hold on to anyway, as the Ukrainians are pushing into Luhansk, they're pushing into Kherson, they're pushing into the territory. So that, if anything, it acts as a stopgap against further Ukrainian advances.
And then what you need, of course, is Joe Biden to endorse the plan. And the curveball at the end, which...
If Joe Biden endorsed that plan, I would not vote for him again because I would finally believe he turned senile. If I'm being for real with you guys.
You know, a lot of people, I mean, everybody's going to disagree with my plan they're putting out here, but this is something that would maybe...
By the way, saying that everybody's going to hate your plan before you propose a very bad plan does not, like, justify, like, see, I knew everybody would... Like, it's if you just propose a bad plan... If I say my plan to solve the student debt crisis is to execute everyone with student debt, like, I can say people are going to hate my plan all across the political spectrum. Yes, because it's a bad plan. That's why people won't like the plan.
Snuff it out in the crib is that I think you should actually allow Ukrainians to vote on it before you actually move forward and propose it.
Okay, so if that's the case, it will be rejected at the ballot box. If you go to Ukrainians and say, here's the plan, you lose Crimea and you have to recognize it as a second country, you can't join NATO, which over 80% of Ukrainians support, by the way, because they know that if they don't join an alliance structure, what's stopping Putin from doing this? Again, this is the big question I would need to ask Kulinski. In this alliance structure that he thinks is going to rebalance Europe and like remake the world and stop another war, how does this stop Russia from just invading either Ukraine or this new kind of artificial state that's being created to like please the Russians, basically saying that this land will not be part of Ukraine? You also tell them you're going to lose Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, and this is going to be all while they're talking to their family members in this territory, part of which is controlled by Ukraine, by the way. So this means Ukraine giving up more territory that it currently controls for this plan to go into effect. They talk to these locals. What are the locals going to say? The Kherson locals, Zaporozhye, they're all going to say, no, we don't want this. We don't want this. So the people locally in this new state don't want it. The vast majority of Ukrainians don't want it. The only person I think would be an advocate for this plan would probably be the government of Vladimir Putin. There's no reality where the Ukrainians would accept this. When the vast majority of Ukrainians don't want to make any territorial concessions to the Russians, you're basically saying Ukraine has to give up 5 separate oblasts: Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Many of these oblasts, which the Ukrainians are making territorial gains in right now as we speak. In the time that I've been talking, another village has probably been liberated. Village that would have to be given up for this plan. There's no way. There is no way the Ukrainians would vote in favor of this. It would be rejected. And the thing is, I appreciate the Kulinski doing this, though, because I've talked about before, when people say negotiate with Putin, my follow-up is always, what would you offer him? What would you accept? Because he's going to come to you and he's going to ask for everything. And he's going to say, oh, this is the bare minimum. What do you mean this is ridiculous? Which they have done on Russian state TV. So what are you going to offer? What's your proposal? And this is what I'll hear, because anything besides what would be largely just like Ukrainian victory on 90% of the issues would end up creating an unequal and unstable world when it comes to the world in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. It would create an unstable system that could easily be violated 5 to 10 years from now when the Russians re-prepare and treat the invasion more seriously, this time with more prep. And let me tell you, next time there's not going to be as much international attention. They're just going to say, oh, look, Russia invaded again. It just keeps happening. It happened 2014, happened 2022. It's happening in 2030. It is what it is. There's going to be less international attention. Ukraine is going to be weaker because it gave up 4 oblasts and Crimea. So it's going to have less people and less defense industry and less economy to fight back with. It's not going to be getting the same amount of aid from the international community. And there's a decent chance it'll be dominated by radicals who are probably emboldened by the centrist Zelenskys caving to the Russian government if something like this was to happen. So this would also be a gift to the Ukrainian far right. I mean, this is such a bad proposal. I'll be honest, this is worse than Elon Musk's proposal. If I'm being completely for real. This is worse than Musk's proposal. It's just slightly, but it is.
Because
at least in Musk's proposal, with that redo of the election and all of these territories that Russia did the sham election in, at least conceptually on paper, even though in effect it would probably never work that way, there is a chance that the locals could actually have their wishes respected by voting to be part of Ukraine. But that's not even a possibility. There is no possibility for Kherson, which the Ukrainians are currently liberating, to be part of Ukraine under the Kyle Kulinski peace plan. Oh man, I say all of this out of love, by the way. I love Kyle, man. He's great. And I mean, like, he helped me make connections between problems I had in my life with, like, the drugs that my family were dealing with, and in the political world when I was a lot younger. And so man, these are not like things I'm saying with joy here. These are not things I'm saying with joy, these criticisms.
Here's my reasoning for that. They were illegally invaded. So when they say, like, no, we're going to defend our own country and we're not going to give an inch away, I'm sympathetic to that. So if the Ukrainian people say, if a majority of the Ukrainian people say, no, fuck off, like, we're going to keep fighting. Corrupt. All right, there's really nothing I could do in that scenario.
So let me just say quickly, the polling data currently says the lowest poll I can find. I found polls that shows like 88%. I found some polls say 93%. The lowest number I can find for the amount of Ukrainians that want to keep fighting is 70%. 70% of Ukrainians. One second. So again, I'm doing arms dealing off screen. 70% of Ukrainians want to keep fighting. There is almost no Ukrainians I could find personally, or I could find poll data to show the majority of Ukrainians would be willing to give up any territory, including Crimea. So I'm just going to be for real. This plan by Kulinski would be rejected by the Ukrainian people outright. It would be rejected by the Ukrainian people outright, because they are willing to deal with more of the brutality of this war if it means that they don't have to sign away the lives of their neighbors in Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea for forever, because that's how Russian occupation would treat them. Even this new, I'm gonna be honest, I don't think this new independent country would last more than a few years, propped up by international actors. It would collapse faster than the ANA upon any invasion, if I'm being completely honest with you guys.
As an outsider.
I don't agree with that. And here's why. Because the only reason that they are where they are in this war is because of us. I mean, not only in terms of, but let me finish my point.
I was going to say half agree.
Not only in terms of the weapons that we have supplied them, in terms of the intelligence we've supplied them. I mean, it's now been reported out how instrumental our intelligence was in some of the key strikes and military accomplishments of the Ukrainian military. This is not to take anything away from their, like, courage and savvy and all those things. But I mean, also economically, like, we are propping up this whole country right now. So the idea that we don't get a say, well, I just don't think that's true. In fact,
I guess we get a say if we want to continue supporting them, if they reject a peace deal. And my argument would be yes, because I think the peace deal that Kyle Kulinski just proposed is awful, is a bad peace deal. It's a bad proposal. It is true that we have been instrumental in helping them in a lot of ways. I guess, like, if we were to step out of the room and say we no longer going to support Ukraine, and then we just have those weapons end up going to Saudi Arabia or some other, which is what would happen, and people can be like, no, we would fight to stop them. Please, don't joke with me. You know the weapons would end up going to the Saudis or LCC or Erdogan, or they'd go to some tin pot, whoever, right? And we would be taking those weapons away from the struggle for democracy, and we'd be selling it to whoever would basically give us the most money. Maybe they end up going to Taiwan. It would go another moral struggle, maybe. But I think we should devote these resources and these weapons, which are already created, already built, we should devote them to this moral struggle. We should devote them to this moral struggle. And yes, we have played a role, but I mean, if you think that the Ukrainians have to settle for mass graves, which is what giving away all this territory permanently would be settling for, you can understand why the average Ukrainian is going to frown upon this plan and probably not going to accept it.
In fact, I think the reason that the war has taken the trajectory that it's taken.
And to be clear, the argument when it comes to like, hey, whether we should continue to support the Ukrainians should not be made. When this argument's made, it cannot be made in the idea of like, we should stop supporting them because we care about the Ukrainians so much. The argument has to be made from a selfish point of like, well, I don't want to send weapons anymore because I want that money to be spent on like healthcare or something like that, which you can make that argument. If we don't send the weapons, the money's not going to be spent on healthcare. It's just going to be spent on some other weapon being sent to someplace else. Let me be 100% real with you, dog. But you can't make the argument out of, well, I don't want to send weapons anymore because I want the violence to stop. Because by you not sending weapons, that doesn't stop the violence. That just means it's going to be easier for the Russians to murder people and harder for the Ukrainians to resist that murder. By you taking the weapon away from a rape victim that they're trying to use to defend themselves, that doesn't make it so less rapes happen, okay? All that does is makes it easier to rape. And I know that's like a very brutal analogy, but I'm being very brutal about this. Like, if you take the tools away from Ukraine that they need to defend themselves, then it will be easier for the Russians to target their electrical supply, to target the water supply, to target civilians, and fill up mass graves. It is what it is.
In large part, and I do view this as a proxy war, is because the U.S. government's policy has been, we don't want this war to end. We want this war to continue. We want to weaken Russia. And so it just was reported in the Washington Post that privately administration officials are saying, we won't even nudge Ukraine to the table. We also know that, Boris Johnson went to Kyiv early on when there were active peace negotiations. There was a lot more prospect of actually coming to a deal early on. He went to Kyiv and delivered what was very likely the U.S. and UK message of, you are not allowed to strike a peace deal. So
that there was no, you're not allowed. I think the exact message that was sent is, we think you can get better conditions. We recommend that you don't accept this deal. There was never, you're not allowed to make a peace deal, or we're gonna stop sending you weapons. That was not what was done. It was a recommendation that the peace deal that's being proposed by the Russians, you could probably get better conditions on, since the Russians have really royally bungled their invasion. Because the Russians were just bungling it up and still making demands, when really the only thing that should even be plausible for the Russians to get is pre 2022 lines. That should have been the only realistic scenario that the Russians could have gotten there. That should have been accepted, possibly even, not even accepted necessarily, but considered by the Ukrainians to rejoin what was the pre-invasion line, since they're failing so miserably. My goodness.
You can say, okay, they can have a vote and it's really up to them, but then there's still a decision for us. Are we going to continue to ship them arms? Are we going to continue to support them in the war effort? Because without us doing that, they're kind of dead in the water.
Okay, so I was going to address that.
And my answer to that would be, yes, we should. Yes, we should. Or we're just going to have to do it 5 or 10 years from now, or have them face even worse fate 5 or 10 years from now when the Russians are reinvigorated. Because if anybody thinks that, like, this peace plan that Kyle's making is sustainable, it's a Treaty of Versailles. And I don't mean to, like, make that comparison because World War II, but, like, it's an unsustainable system. You're creating artificial states that, like, the locals don't even want to exist. Like, you're not creating a sustainable system. It's quite literally, what he's doing is not too far off from what the British did, and the Americans did, and the Russians, and all these different European imperial powers did when they looked at Africa and was like, well, to keep the peace, we're going to carve it in this way, just completely disregarding, like, local customs and local traditions and ethnic groups. Like if the locals don't want the government, like, the odds of the government being stable are pretty low.
Yeah.
And the answer is, when Biden endorses the plan, that's a wink and a nod of like, look, if you guys don't take this, that's on you. Like, you're sort of on your own now.
Yeah.
You've already given them $50 to $80 billion worth of weapons. I mean,
so Kyle Kulinski's solution is to basically make a proposal where Ukraine loses Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, many of the territory they're reclaiming right now, by the way, or have already reclaimed large swaths of, and Crimea. They give up all of that. They don't agree to be any long-term defensive agreement or defensive alliance structure, right? They can't join NATO. They can't join anything that the vast majority of Ukrainians want to join, so they can stop an invasion like this happening again in the future. We're not building a system that is going to be stable, because making this artificial state that locals want, not a stable system, right? It's probably not going to last too long. It's going to be solely propped up by the United Nations, it seems. It's not going to be wanted. And the Ukrainians are going to look at these proposals. They're going to obviously say this completely disregards our local customs and what we want, so we reject it. And Kyle's balance after that is like, okay, well, if they don't accept this shitty deal that gives Putin most of what he wants and gives Ukraine none of what it wants, then you're up shit creek. United States is not here for you. I already gave you too much. Goodbye. Okay, got you.
I would have stopped after like 3 packages. We're on package, what, 17 or some shit like that? So Biden proposing this to Zelensky is, it's sort of implied like, hey, man, this is the out. Either shit or get off the pot.
Yeah.
So in other words, that answers your concern there. But I also will say this. You were talking about, oh, the U.S. was blocking peace, whatever. But they also have the will to fight. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, they have the will to fight.
Let's not pretend. Like, Biden loves to pretend like, oh, this is just on the Ukrainians and we're just going to do whatever they want. Bullshit. Okay?
Yeah, we have sway.
Not just sway. We're determinative. Like, they don't get to this place anywhere close to it without our arms, economic support, intelligence, training over years. Like,
we do the supplying and they do the dying, is how I say it, right? But to be clear, that doesn't mean Ukraine doesn't ever act on its own. It has acted on its own, even sometimes against what we wanted on multiple occasions. I don't think it's like they're literally like our puppets or anything, but they will certainly listen to U.S. concerns because they want to continue to get our aid. Because our aid has been very useful in stopping a bunch of mass graves, not only being in Izium, Bucha, and Lyman, but also in Kiev and Lviv. Which, my God, could you imagine if the Russians got their hands on the local political scene in Kiev and Lviv?
Like, none of it. And again, that is not to diminish their efforts and their losses and their courage and all of that. But it's just to be real. Like, they're nowhere in this war without our support. So... yeah, if you say, okay, you vote on it, and if you guys say no, then all right, we're out. That means effectively
they're more likely to take it.
Well, not only that, but I mean, that means effectively, if they did vote against it, Russia is winning that war. If we follow through on truly with, pulling our military
aid.
aid.
About that, because if they already have $50 to $80 billion of military equipment, then they're already, you could hunker down for.
Also, to be clear, we don't know that other actors wouldn't also try to pick up the slack. I doubt that they'd be able to pick up all of the slack. There's no way. But we would ultimately be basically saying that Ukraine's going to have to suffer a lot more in order to get their independence. But again, this is just this almost just feels like an excuse to basically clean our hands of Ukraine. Like, not our issue anymore. You get genocided. It's your business, not ours. Because the Ukrainians would never accept this plan, because the plan's just not good. It doesn't respect local customs. It's not sustainable. This plan doesn't guarantee that this wouldn't stop the Russians from invading again. Like, what about this plan would even stop the Russians from invading again in the future? Or invading this new state that has been created and is going to be upheld by the United Nations that none of the locals want. Especially since none of the locals want it, it's going to basically be invaded. We can already see the narratives the Russians would create. This artificial UN globalist state created by Western policymakers and podcaster Kyle Kulinski, and not nice Russian Slavic. It doesn't respect local customs. What does it trust the Orthodox Church? I heard they had a pride event in Kherson recently, and then they invade again. And then this time, instead of Ukrainians having the element of Western support and the spyglass on them and the international attention on them and all these weapons and the backing of the United States and of course having a disorganized Russia with bad logistics who is mobilizing and having its nation slowly turn against the war, instead of having all these advantages, they're going to have less people, less territory, less population to pull from, less attention, less Western support, and it's going to be much harder for Ukraine to stand against Russia again. If anything, this would just be one step closer for Russia eventually encapsulating and capturing all of Ukraine, which is its ultimate goal. This just puts them one step closer by making Ukraine weaker. which that's what this agreement does. We cannot accept an agreement that's going to put Ukraine in a weaker position to defend itself in the future, which splitting it up into two separate states would 100% undoubtedly do. Definitely, since one of those states would be inherently unstable since nobody wants it.
Quite a fucking while with that amount of military support. And it's no guarantee that the rest of the world follows if we stop supporting them with literally anything and everything they want.
We've gone so much. I mean, the amount that we have shipped and the amount of dollars we've used to support them economically and keep them afloat. Because remember, I mean, the economic damage that they've suffered is catastrophic. Like, to even be able to float their government,
That's another reason why
we've been
they might accept.
instrumental in all of this.
That's
So
another reason why
even
they might
if
accept.
Europe is like,
They wouldn't accept. To be clear, they will not accept this peace plan. There is no proposal that is even somewhat close to this that would ever be accepted by the Ukrainian people if it was put up to a vote. Just, it wouldn't. Like, if this was like a popular vote thing in Ukraine, it would be voted against. There's no, it could be 5 years from now from brutal fighting. They would not accept this. They just wouldn't. Just wouldn't. There's like, all you're doing with this plan is just screwing over Ukraine and making it so when the Russians invade 10 years from now, there'll be less guns and weapons and soldiers to defend against the mass graves being filled. Unironically, this does nothing but make Ukraine weaker for a future invasion.
yo, we're still in. They're still in really dire straits
I understand
without us.
that,
Yeah.
but you're almost bolstering my plan here because that's another reason why they'd be like, I might not like all this.
No,
In fact,
I
hate
agree
a
with
lot
that.
of this.
No, they hate all of it. There's none of the deal that's good for Ukraine. This does nothing but give Russia what it wants.
That's why I really get annoyed with, this isn't aimed at you really, I really get annoyed with Biden administration officials pretending like it's just hands off and we're just letting this all unfold when your plan and like logically thinking this through demonstrates how much incredible, not just sway and influence, but what like absolute direct impact we have ultimately on this war. And so when we pretend like, oh,
And so we have, yes, and I guess what she's saying is bolstering my point a bit, where, okay, we can have immense impact, so let's win the war. What is it with like the impossibility for people to like recognizing that we can like win wars and other adversaries can lose them? Like Russia could just lose, right? I know that's impossible to think about. They lost in Afghanistan. They nearly lost in Chechnya, for God's sakes. And that was against people on horseback getting shipped weapons by Chinese mules through the border regions where they didn't even control the main roads. And this is against a modernized military with logistics and HIMARS and missiles, and they don't even have air control over all of Ukraine. Like, I know for a lot of people it's impossible to conceive of the Russian military losing, but like, they've lost before, they can lose again. And they've lost before against smaller, weaker targets than Ukraine is. But the last thing we should do is basically set the Russians up to do this again, because they've been playing this game for 8 years. They've been playing this game even longer than 8 years, since Putin's regime was in power, where they've been trying to assassinate Ukrainian politicians, foment corruption, back people up, and, invaded Crimea. They've supported weapons shipments to the Donbass and Luhansk and Donetsk. They tried to set up like a fake little proxy state in Kharkiv that failed. They tried to take Mariupol and failed. They tried to take Odessa and failed. They tried to take out, when I'm talking about Mariupol, I'm talking more like 2014, 2015. They've been doing this for 8 years. They've been trying to chip away slowly at Ukraine. So why would they not see the opportunity to permanently strip 4 oblasts away from Ukraine as just like, okay, we'll accept that for now. It'll be so much easier to take that 4 years from now when that fake proxy state's going to be unstable. And it's going to be much easier to invade Ukraine in the future since they're going to have less territory, less soldier, and a weaker economy. And the international community is not going to care as much because it's just, hey, Ukraine's getting invaded again like they always do. Like, what about this would actually preserve long-term stability for the Ukrainians? I don't see it.
oh, we're not really doing much. We're just watching from afar and hoping for the best. Total and utter bullshit.
But we are facilitating and allowing the Ukrainians to do self-defense. Maybe that's why I'm not as offended by it as you are, is because I do ultimately see it as defensive. Even though we are propping it up, we are allowing it to get, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, listen, I totally understand the Ukrainian perspective. And
by the way, can I just say, Kyle Kulinski is taking the anti-populist, right? Anti-popular position. He's going against the vast majority of Americans when he's saying what he's saying, right? we've actually seen support for sending military shipments to Ukraine go up in recent months. It went up from 53% to 66% in the last 3 months due to recent Ukrainian successes, showing that Americans want to have a moral United States acting on the international community. I think a lot of people just naturally think Americans just want to like be isolationists, curl up in a ball, and have America be like, oh, genocide over there, we do nothing, or oh, you know, we do nothing because Iraq. But I don't think that's how most Americans want to act. In fact, the polling data suggests that that's not what the most majority of Americans want to act. Even when you poll Americans on the economic detrimental effects of the war, like what if this war means that you're going to pay more at the pump and groceries cost more? The majority of Americans still, no, not even the majority, the vast majority of Americans still support Ukraine and sending, not only support Ukraine, but support America sending weapons to Ukraine. And so I don't see any reason for us to rush to cut off the tap to Ukraine when the majority of Americans are perfectly comfortable with sending these weapons to Ukraine. If this is what Americans want their tax dollars going to, our tax dollars could be going to drone strikes in Somalia and Yemen. And this is the first time where Americans are like, actually, this is the first time since like 9/11, we're like, actually, maybe we do want America to be involved over here. Maybe we do want America to take this stance on the world stage. And we're saying, no, we have to pull back. We need to pull back. We need to pull back on this. It's not like if we don't send these weapons to Ukraine, these weapons are gonna like magically end up in the hands of like the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. They're just gonna end up in the hands of someone like El Sisi or Saudi Arabia. There's a decent chance they will. And we should change our relationship with nations like Saudi Arabia. And we should support young democracies like Ukraine. And instead of supporting monarchies like Saudi Arabia with weapons sales. This is from VoiceBox TV. I mean, we would pay less at the pump if the U.S. just nationalized the oil industry and outlawed fossil fuels in favor of green technology anyway. I don't necessarily know if it would be that easy. But, you know, I would like to believe it would be that easy because it makes me sleep easier at night.
And it's absolutely just. It's just their interest and our interests, and more importantly, the interests of the globe, are not 100% aligned. And in my view, I care a lot more.
Again, we need to ensure long-term stability. Long-term stability is not ensured by this peace plan, which is the interests of the globe. The interest of the globe is also making sure that when people make nuclear threats, the response to that isn't, let's reward you. So then people in Eritrea, the dictatorship there, and other dictatorships which have nuclear weapons like North Korea, don't get the message like, oh, nuclear threats work. If we just invade country and threaten to blow up the world, then we're going to get what we want. That's not going to help start nuclear non-proliferation. That's going to make a bunch of despots and terror groups. What kind of messages to send to Al-Qaeda? Just going to send them into a frenzy thinking all we need to do is get our weapons on get our hands on one of these warheads and we're Gucci, man. We're going to reclaim the Holy Land. It's the bad message to send. It's a bad message to send, man.
About the interests of the globe in avoiding nuclear war than I do about Ukrainian territorial integrity.
Okay. Maybe, but
wait, what did she say she cares more about?
And in my view, I care a lot more about the interests of the globe in avoiding nuclear war than I do about Ukrainian territorial integrity.
Okay.
But the problem is she's just going to, all this is going to do is cause another nuclear confrontation 10 years down the road with Ukraine in a weaker position. And then 10 years from now, we're going to have Kyle Kulinski and Crystal Ball, okay, in their 10-year wedding anniversary, talking about how Ukraine has to give up Kiev for diplomatic protection. Right? And then maybe this time if they just join the Russian security alliance, and then we're going to be in the same position, but with Ukraine in a weaker negotiating position. And again, if you want to care about the world security when it comes to nuclear weapons, the last thing you want to do is encourage dictators to go rescue scientists from around the world, bring them to their dictatorial paradise and develop nuclear weapons so they can do what Russia did in Ukraine. I mean, the thing is, Russia took the L when it came to Afghanistan. We took the L when it came to Afghanistan. We took the L when it came to Vietnam. Russia took the L when it came to invading Poland during the early stages of the Soviet Union. Now, I understand that the Polish one wasn't during the nuclear age, but Afghanistan certainly was for both of us. Why didn't they use nukes then? They killed millions of Afghans. Millions. Displaced millions too. Internally and externally. They didn't use nuclear weapons. And that was the Soviet Union, a much more powerful entity than the current Russian Federation. All I'm saying is this is all based upon the idea that if we don't sign away tons of territory, then we're going to have a nuclear holocaust, which is already based off of like a faulty foundation. But also, what is this? Why do we believe that rewarding this behavior would not encourage similar threats a few years from now?
Maybe, but maybe not, because if, let's say hypothetically, we agree to this deal or some similar like peace deal, right?
Yeah.
And then Russia's like, great, sure, here, sign off on it, boom, done. And then in 2 years or 3 years, there's another fucking invasion of another country that's right on their border, then it is fair to call this appeasement that didn't work. I'm willing.
True. I appreciate Kulinski biting the bullet because he hasn't addressed this. Like, what would stop the Russians from doing this again? Because if we put Ukraine in an alliance structure, then we have an answer to that. What stops them from doing it again? The alliance structure, right? Even if it wasn't like NATO, but it was like America will make the promise that if Ukraine's invaded again, we will have American troops on the streets of Kiev. Or like making some, you would have to like create some guarantees, system of guarantees to make Ukrainians feel safe. Because as much as they don't like to suffer now, Ukrainians don't want to pass on the suffering to a next generation of Ukrainians. Because they've suffered for hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of years, and they do not want to pass it to another generation. So they need to deal with this now, so we don't have to deal with this again in 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years from now.
Willing to admit, I know I'm proposing a peace deal here. I am freely willing to admit, if I get everything I want here, I could still be dead wrong, and the answer could have been no peace deal. The answer maybe, potentially, could have been, should have been, no, keep giving them fucking weapons, defeat Russia so they know you can't do shit like this.
If they don't have nuclear weapons, then that idea would have a lot more purchase with me. But they do.
I agree.
And that's just reality.
We funded the Mujahideen through Chinese mules being shipped through China with the Chinese. For 10 years. 10 years we did that. It was part of the reason the Soviet Union collapsed, fell apart. Why was there no nuclear war then? No strategic nuclear strikes. The Afghans could fight less back than the Ukrainians can. They just didn't have the same level of equipment. Like we cannot reward this behavior. This is the same, but the fact they have nuclear weapons can come to our calculus, but the calculus can be, okay, so we don't invade Russia, you know? We don't directly put American troops on the ground so we don't have two nuclear powers fighting it out. This is the ways we've already have accounted for this. But the accounting for the fact that Russia has nukes cannot be, okay, how much do we give Russia to appease them? Which is what this is, whether we like it or not. It's like, how much can we give them to make them stop for now? Since this, again, the structure which he's trying to build does not guarantee long-term stability. It gives Ukraine no guarantees that an invasion would happen again. He didn't even state any guarantees that Ukraine would be given. Defensive-wise, from the UK, from France, from Germany, from the United States, there's zero motivation for Ukraine to accept this peace deal because this peace deal doesn't even guarantee peace.
Burns is an immoral, morally
it doesn't even guarantee peace, man. It doesn't even guarantee peace. That means they could give up 5 oblast, any part of an alliance structure, for a peace that'll go away in 5 years. So all they're doing is signing away territory, which means tons of brutality to the local population there, only to get invaded again in 10 years. With Russia more determined and them in a weaker position. Now is the opportunity. Ukraine has to take advantage of it.
I agree, which is why we're fundamentally on the same page with it.
And so, I mean, you can pretend like, oh, that shouldn't sway you and that shouldn't influence you, but that's fucking reality. And you have to deal with the fact that the risk, right now, the risk of a catastrophic world-ending nuclear war is pretty high. But
it's not. Stop falling for it. It's not that high. The Russians have made no threats that could be indicated to suggest that they're going to make a nuclear strike in the near future. It's all the same. It's always this. It's always, we reserve the right to use the nuclear weapon when it comes to the survival of the Russian state. If they were about to move the nuclear arsenal off from the negotiating table, which is what it's currently on, and they moved it to the table of we're about to actually do a strike, the statements we would see from Moscow would be much closer to, if the United States does not stop supporting Ukraine, we will use a nuclear, that's what we're going to see. Because they would want to they want to get results without the massive backlash that would come with a nuclear weapon. And so they would do everything they could to emphasize the fact that they're going to use it before they use it. because they want to do every single outcome before using a nuclear weapon, because as we talked about before, there's a decent chance the order won't be followed. There's a decent chance the radiation could actually seep into Moscow and the rest of Russia. And I'm not saying that hypothetically. I mean, Chernobyl, the reason why the world knew about Chernobyl was because the radiation went all the way up to Sweden. And that was in Pripyat in Ukraine. There's the problem with the delivery system being complicated and the fact that it could fail. There's also the problem about huge economic backlash from the international community, from China signing on to a price cap, and India signing on to a price cap when it comes to Russian oil, because neither of them wants this type of behavior to be normalized. There's so many problems that come in the way to stop them from using a nuclear weapon that would most likely be delivered through artillery or again, truck delivered rocket that would have not much of an effect on the battlefield, but kill a ton of civilians in Ukraine. But the odds of that happening again from many, many, many factors are quite low. And I'm sick of people being alarmists and pretending that the world's on the brink of ending. And if we don't give Russia more territory to fill up with bodies, then like the world's gonna explode. I'm tired of people saying that. I'm tired of respecting like that's a respectable position, because it's not. It's not. God, man.
It's definitely the highest in our lifetimes, definitely the highest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so even though, look, I don't like the idea of like, giving into any of their demands at all. And I understand the Ukrainian position 100%, but that outcome is so catastrophic that it must be avoided at even at a high cost. And the other thing I would say about this, and you and I have gone back and forth on this a million times, but I just have to put it on here again, is I just can't imagine on this idea of, that would be appeasement. No one is going to look at the experience of Russia in all of this, which has been catastrophic for them, and be like, that's something I want to repeat.
Rushing, dude, I mean, they invaded Georgia. They brutalized Grozny to international back. Like, they annexed Crimea in 2014. The Russian government has ideological tendencies. And so we can't just say that, because the people went through suffering of Russia, the government would never do anything that would make the Russian people suffer. I mean, when it comes to the history of Russia, I mean, there was this joke that always gets talked about this book that gets sold that's called The History of Russia. And on each page, it just says, and then it got worse. Right? The idea that hardcore nationalists like Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Medvedev, or any of the rest of these loons, whether it be Shoigu, Lavrov, wouldn't also try this again once given the opportunity, I think is putting a little too much faith in Putin. Just like we all thought, well, this has been so bad for the amount of sanctions that has been deployed against Russia, they're gonna respect the Minsk agreement, and they didn't, because it wasn't enough to demotivate the government from trying it again. Because the message we're sending them is, yeah, you can put your people through suffering, but you'll eventually get what you want anyway. You'll get Crimea. You'll get all this territory separated from Ukraine. You'll get a guarantee that Ukraine doesn't get part of NATO. The message we'll send to the government is they'll look at the end of it like, wow, that was pretty rough for us, but we got what we wanted, didn't we? That's still the message they're going to receive. They might take more time to prepare next time, but that doesn't mean that they won't do it again. I think she's trusting a little bit too much in the humaneness or the respect for Russia's population that the Russian government has right now.
Russia will not even if, like, okay, we give them Crimea and these regions are independent or whatever, and they feel like, we got our way, which first of all,
that's the face-saving thing.
Yeah, I mean, and it is face-saving, because ultimately they de facto had Crimea anyway.
Exactly.
But, Russia has been barely able to prosecute this war and has burned through lots of their stockpiles and many of, thousands of their people and lots of political will, and the, regime may be on shaky political footing. It's hard to tell from the outside at this point. Even if they were like, that was really great, let's do it again, I don't even think they're capable of doing it, because they've been so economically and militarily undercut by their own actions here. So I am very skeptical of the idea that anyone would look at a deal similar to what you're proposing, which I think that would be the general outlines of, something like that would be the type of deal that would be struck, that anyone would look at that and that would be like, that was awesome for Russia, and yeah, I want to do that too.
So
it gives them most of what they've been asking for. Like, all of their recent demands, This gives them most of it. The only thing is that they don't get direct control over all this territory. And here, Son Zaporozhye, this. But a big demand of the Russian government has been the federalization of Ukraine, so they can weaken Ukraine, so it'd be easier for them to attack Ukraine in the future. So this does make it easier to attack Ukraine in the future. There's actually incentives being laid with this peace proposal for Russia to invade in the future under the belief that Ukraine would be in a weaker position. Definitely, since none of this settles the idea of placing Ukraine in a defensive structure that could protect them from invasion in the future. And why should Ukraine consider global international stability, as Crystal and is talking about here, if the global international community isn't going to stand with Ukraine and put them in a structure that will defend them? Why should they agree to an agreement to help the international community breathe a sigh in relief in the short term, if in the long term, this means Ukraine will be in a weaker position with no one to back them up? No one to back them up. No one.
Oh, let me just say, I hope you're 100% right. I hope you're 1,000,000% right. I would like nothing more than the exact thought process that you're talking about here, which would potentially prevent Putin from trying something like this again in the future, which would mean if that's the case, then I think my deal is honestly genius, and it wasn't appeasement. It was the correct thing to do at the correct time, right?
I think they're really judging Putin's moral character and his cronies' moral character very differently than how I have it judged, to be completely frank.
But you're assuming that he values, the economic hit and the dissent of the public more than he values the goal of gaining land and bringing back the glory of the Russian Empire. Because if the textbooks view him in the future as like, he brought us back to our glory, he gained more territory, he'll say the price was worth it.
I only think he cares about his own power and not losing his life. I mean, they talk about...
Well, but the thing is, he cares about his own power, but he also cares about Russian influence and Russia dominating. He is a Russian nationalist. Putin, the thing is with oligarchs and these types of people, is some people think, they only care about their own power. That's not necessarily true. They have ideological foundations. Putin has wrote multiple articles describing his ideological justification for this war. He wrote it back one in 2021, and he released a speech before this invasion. And in it, he very clearly outlines that, look, Ukraine is artificial. It's an artificial state. It does not deserve to exist. It was created by Lenin, and we have a right to take it back. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was a massive tragedy. And much of what he said would also be a justification to go after Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and others. So we can't undersell the fact that Russia's leader is a Russian nationalist who doesn't believe Ukraine has a right to exist, and he wants to get rid of Ukraine and wants to make it part of Russia, which he believes will strengthen Russia and also lead to him being one of the glorious leaders of Russia's history and rebuilding the power of the Russian Empire and the strength of the Soviet Union when Russia had more international respect and prestige. So, to be quite frank, I don't think that this would be the end. I think Putin would simply just plan his next move and be like, phew, that was a close call. The Ukrainians had me on the rope for a little bit, but that podcaster really made a compelling argument somehow, and they took me off the ropes. They gave me a deal, and we'll just have to plan where we go from here. That's what would happen.
I assume.
They talk about in that article, though, the War on the Rocks one, about how he obsessively watches the death of Gaddafi, and is like, sort of, these are people who want to preserve their life and preserve their power
and his legacy.
And ultimately, I think those are the things that are going to, be more influential both for him and for other autocrats like him.
Okay, he might be terminally ill. He might die soon. I think he wants to be able to say, yeah, I brought us back to the former glory of the Russian Empire. We got back territory that we had given away wrongly when the Soviet Union broke up.
I don't see that anyone could take that as the conclusion away from the sequence of events.
Well, because the problem is if we give them this deal, his thing is we were put in the most dangerous position Russia's put in the modern history, but we won. The West broke. They cracked. Their degenerate globo homo agenda couldn't keep them together, and they accepted this podcaster's proposal, and now we got all this territory. Crimea is recognized. The sanctions are being lifted. Our economy's chugging along again. We guaranteed water access to Crimea. All this territory has been separated from Ukraine. Ukraine's weaker than ever. The next time we invade, It'll be easier, and we'll be more prepared, and we'll learn from our mistakes, just like the Soviets did in Finland. And I don't have any reason to believe that that would be anything other than that message would be sent to the Kremlin. The global homo agenda, they didn't implement your agenda yet, though, and they will eventually.
I mean,
you don't know what he values, though. That could be what he values more than whatever the economic hit is and
but
whatever the
even
number
that,
of people who died is.
how could anyone argue this restored them to their former glory? They're global pariahs now.
Maybe
I mean,
it's about a 100-year view.
Even
The problem is we're Westerners. We view it differently than how they view it. The way we view it as Americans is very different than how Russians domestically in Russia view the war and view the results of the war. Where it's just differently. It's hard for us to be able to relate to exactly what the Russian people feel about this conflict because we're not Russian. It's a Russian view of history.
China and India are like, we're kind of not feeling you on what you're doing right now.
It's about 100 years in the future. He wants to have a legacy, and he's trying to make this his legacy. That's all I'm saying. All I'm saying is that's possible. I hope you're right, and you might be right in your analysis that it's not worth it because of all these fucking downsides, and we can list 20,000 downsides for him, and you're right about all those things.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is don't be 100% sure in that analysis because he could value the gaining of the territory more than he values any of all the things associated with this.
But to zoom out again, I'll take, I won't say 100%, right? I think I'm right that no one would look at this and be like, this was great, let's do it. This was good for Russia.
They would just plan it differently. This doesn't mean because they got out of it, they survived. But this expansion of territory is pretty, it seems to be what Russia has concentrated on for the last 8-10 years when talking about Ukraine, right? So I have no reason to believe that this is something that they're just going to drop once this war is over. I think they're just going to go back to the drawing board and think of a new plan, think of a new way to exploit Western weaknesses, hoping that next time the world won't pay as much attention and that next time they'll be better prepared, they'll deal with the corruption issue more. And now that Ukraine has been separated from 5 oblasts, they're going to be with a lot less people, they're going to have a lot less economic power and a lot less soldiers to fight back with. It puts the Russians in a better position to invade next time, to be quite frank, this agreement, when the agreement that will preserve peace should make it so war is almost practically impossible, or it puts the Russians in a more difficult position to invade. It should be harder to invade Ukraine once the war is over than it was before the war started. That is how you make a sustainable peace.
And my legacy and whatever, but the risk of nuclear war is so grave and so dangerous and staring us so much in the face that it is overwhelmingly worth trying to come to some sort of deal, even, a painful one. And any deal will be a painful one. There's no doubt about it.
Why do you think I'm making an ass of myself and proposing this?
Yeah.
And I'm going to get dunked on by everybody. The pro-Ukraine people are going to hate me because you're giving away too much and it's appeasement. And the pro-Russian
Well, because it is, but I mean, okay.
people are going to be like,
whatever.
I don't even know what the pro-Russian people are going to say.
I have a hard time getting in their heads, too.
It's kind of weird that he couldn't think of a complaint the pro-Russian crowd would have for this deal. I think most of the pro-Russian crowd would generally smile on the agreement. It isn't exactly what they wanted, but it's definitely the best they could get out of this.
Yeah, they're going to be like, no, Donbass has to be ours too, or some shit. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, people.
What do you mean? This basically look, I'm sorry. If you think that an independent Donbass, Kherson, Zaporozhye republic would stand the test of time, and they developed this separate culture and this wouldn't eventually, there would be an attempt either by Ukraine or Russia to get that territory back, I think you're sorely mistaken, man. Sorely mistaken. This was part of Russia's strategy, was to weaken Ukraine by splitting it up so it could consume it piece by piece by piece. It would be a lot easier than taking on all of Ukraine at once, which this just gives them that. It gives them that. It gives them one of the paths forward, one of the only foreseeable paths forward for Russia to actually take all of Ukraine eventually. This is one of the few paths they could use to actually do that.
People are very, invested in simple narratives, but ultimately, and the really troubling thing is the further we go and the more steps on the escalatory path that are taken, the more difficult it becomes to even imagine something like this happening, which is why, those early days when there were actual discussions that were going on, there were talks that were happening in Turkey in particular, and those got short-circuited. I mean, that just made it so much harder to envision how this comes to a close.
So what do you think of my deal?
I'll take it.
You'll take it?
Yeah.
Is there anything you would change? Any big thing you would change?
Chat, we have two chats. We have site chat and we have Twitch chat. I want to ask both. Do you like this deal or do you hate this deal? Okay, I want to know. What do you guys think? Do you like the deal or do you hate the deal? Would you vote in favor? You're a voter. Do you vote in favor of it or against it? I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. No, fuck no. No, site chat, Twitch chat hates it. You can't see Twitch chat on stream right now. That is vulgar. 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 Hate it. No, you guys do not like it. Obviously, all your chat will hate it. Well, yeah, because I have a very Ukrainian community. But, hey, if anything, out of all the communities on Twitch, considering how many Ukrainians are my community, considering all the political channels on Twitch, and knowing that mine has a decent-sized Ukrainian community, this is the closest I could imagine myself to conducting a poll like this. I could actually message my Ukrainian friends, and we could be like, hi, I got some Ukrainians together to have them vote on Kyle's peace plan and what they think of it. Oh, should I do that? Should I gather a call with like 4 or 5 Ukrainians that I know and like sit them down and give them this proposal and whether they would vote in favor of it or not and publish the results? I think that'd be interesting. I think it was treated too much as a joke for a show. BS plan with 100 bits. Do it? Yes. It's content. It is. It is content. Not a terrible idea. I know some people who would participate in this, I think. Let me see if I can get this done. It's a waste of time. It would be, I think it could, look, they said they wanted Ukrainians to vote on it. And I can give them the rare experience of actually having like 5 or 6 Ukrainians vote on it, okay? We'll see how it goes. I'll see, maybe we'll try it, maybe we won't, who knows? We'll see what happens. Where were we? Back to the video.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on like international peace negotiations. But
I am.
I do sort of like your provision of like Ukrainians can vote on it, so they have a say.
Yeah.
But listen,
and right now they'll probably defeat it, to be honest. But in 5 years, if there's still, 125,000 people died, they'll be like, oh my God, we should have done the deal back then.
Okay, so there's two things. He acknowledges that right now that Ukrainians probably wouldn't accept it. I can't see any reality where Ukrainians accept it, even with years of fighting. But I also like the number he throws out. Maybe like in 5 years when 125,000 people have died, that's already undershooting the amount of people who have already probably died in this war. Like most of that number is already made up by people who died in Mariupol. I think that, at least from the local estimates that I get.
It's going to go on for 5 years with this all still existing. But, I would not make it oblique. I would make it totally clear that if you vote this down, that's fine. Like, you get to do what you're going to do with your own land, but we're out. I think you have to make that really clear.
I mean, I wouldn't have Biden literally say that to Zelensky, but I would have a wink and a nod of like, look, just so.
Well, I think if the Ukrainian people, we're telling the Ukrainians, you can keep fighting for yourself, but you will not get America's help, and we will take the tools that we would have given you, and we're probably going to end up sending it to Saudi Arabia or somebody else, or sell it to somebody else, but you're not getting it. And I think that we should do what the vast majority of Americans want and can continue to support this moral struggle. As France helped us during our Revolutionary War, we should help the Ukrainians in their defense of their young, fragile, and flawed democracy. I mean, I'm just saying, I'm just communicating what the vast majority of Americans want. I'm taking the populist position. Dylan Populist Burns, as the kids on the street call me.
So this is what's on the table, like it or dislike it. And so you guys can decide if you want to hop into this, but I highly recommend you do, because if you don't, there are going to be consequences to that are not great.
Yeah.
So anyway, I know I'm a genius, even though literally 98% of you are going to be like, fucking stupid ass, dumbass plan, appeasement, Neville Chamberlain, fucking whatever.
Both sides will accuse you of siding with Nazis, so they'll make some sort of Nazi
Both sides will accuse me of siding with Nazis. Both sides will accuse me of being a dupe. Both sides, all this shit. I know it's coming, but look, there's.
I think this is genuine from Kyle, so I'm not like angry at him. I'm just more disappointed.
I want some sort of negotiation, some sort of peace deal. And even if that means, let's say it doesn't work, let's say it is appeasement, let's say 3 years from now there's another invasion in another place
That's
that's
better
on the
than
border,
fucking
whatever.
nuclear war.
Yeah, because then we've...
What the fuck? Then Crystal, all that would mean under even your own model is that means that you're just having second nuclear crisis, which means outside. Okay, even under Crystal's old model, this would mean we don't have one possible nuclear crisis. We just have 2 separate nuclear crises divided by a 5-year time span, depending on when the invasion comes. That doesn't. Okay, whatever.
Just kick the can for nuclear war
we're
down at
all
least
still
3
here
or 4
to be
years.
like, Kyle was wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You're welcome. I just gave you 3 or 4 more years, you assholes. Take it. God damn it. All right.
That's your Ukrainian.
If you want to see me and Crystal...
God, okay. Well, I'm very dissatisfied with that plan. I don't think Ukrainians would vote for it. I don't think there's basically any chance for Ukrainians to vote for that plan, even now or in 5 years. It is what it is. God. Disappointed.